The Dialed In Angling podcast presented by Onyx Fish, Runnings, Arneson's Rocky Point Resort, Visit Watertown, South Dakota, Mantrap Lake Lodge, and Visit Cook County. Well, this week's installment of the Dialed In Angling podcast, I want to recap the week that I had of fishing with my son. You know, August doesn't have to be the dog days of summer. You know, that's often referred to as the dog days of summer. Once you hit that mid-August period, you know, things slow down, the bites aren't going, the lake surface temperatures are heating up. You know, maybe in the past, you know, that was always kind of the referred to that. I think a lot among walleye anglers in particular, or even bass anglers that, you know, maybe just didn't have the greatest electronics back in the day, but that really doesn't have to be the case anymore. The dog days of summer, to me, doesn't exist. There's plenty of fishing opportunities out there. There's plenty of experiences and destinations that you can go to this time of year in the Midwest and be very successful catching fish. A lot of it has to do with, obviously, electronics, has to do with mapping technology, the way we fish today, the better informed we are as anglers as far as fishing a little bit deeper or pressing out to different areas. Prime example of that would be for walleyes. You know, back in the day, it was live bait rigging. As soon as the weeds came up, that became a little more challenging. Anglers would slide out to mid-lake humps and do sort of the same old status quo, rigging and jigging, maybe pulling spinners, at the very most crankbaits on the outside edges of the weed lines. And you were sort of limited to just that. Now we can do all of that, plus we can target fish that are suspended in the water column, whether it's, you know, trolling techniques or pitching techniques with forward-facing sonar. There's a ton of plastics out there, hair jigs, all sorts of different tools, jigging wraps, all sorts of different tools that you can now target that same species and be very successful, in August. Not to say that August isn't going to have up and down days. I just experienced it this week where, you know, I was on a particular body of water, super clear. I was guiding. And, the first day we were out, it was windy and the fish were biting. I mean, we put fish in the boat pretty rapidly. We got some nice ones. We got a few keeper walleyes, but they were biting. The very next day I went out, it was dead flat calm, same clear body of water, super, super gin clear, even though it's got a little color this time of year just because it's August and we get a little bit of an algae bloom. But, you know, on the spectrum or the scale of clarity, this lake was extremely, extremely clear. And they weren't biting that well. I had to target a lot of fish to catch those fish. But I also was able to kind of adapt to that. What I mean by that is to trigger some of the fish that weren't biting because I was able to see them on my forward-facing sonar or on my electronics. I quickly noticed that the fish were following, but they weren't eating. And so I sort of changed up a couple things. I actually went to longer leaders. I was pitching jigs. I was pitching bobbers. I went to longer leaders, and that was a game changer. It didn't go from every fish biting, but it went from fish that weren't biting at all to some fish that were biting. And so that's sort of my what I mean by changing up things or changing to changing conditions or rapidly changing or being able to adapt to a changing bite in August to make it so it's not dog days of summer. Also bass fishing on that same sort of scale. You know, back in the day, you'd pitch docks or fish shallow if the fish weren't biting. Kind of just chalk it up to the dog days of summer. Now with electronics, mapping technology, side imaging, forward-facing sonar, you know, I'm catching largemouth bass and smallmouth bass off of deeper humps. I can see them behind boulders, weed edges. I can see the fish down in the vegetation. So I'm throwing more drop shots. I'm swimming mooch minnows over the top of them. I'm fishing bass that are suspended in a basin like 4 to 5 feet down that I never would have known existed if it hadn't been for technology. And so making those dog days of summer sort of disappear. And I wanted to touch on that early in the podcast because I know for a lot of people, their kids are getting ready to go back to school. There might be fitting in a few last minute vacations, but they're thinking, it's going to be more tubing than fishing just because we're in, sort of that time period of the summer. Doesn't have to be that way. So case in point, almost every year in August, I try to take a week off in August and we go somewhere, as a family. I made it a priority as a fishing guide and my career in fishing. I'm fortunate enough that I'm extremely busy to the point that I need to take days off to go fishing with my family. And I know that sounds strange to people that, out there, if you're listening, if you're a casual angler, you might say, well, you take a day off to go fishing, but I really do. I love fishing. I love experiencing new fishing experiences. If you listen to this podcast, I love discovering new lakes, discovering new bites, trying new things. So every single year in August, I try to take time off for a week, and my wife and I pick different destinations. A lot of my destinations are based on angling experiences. My wife likes to fish and she likes our kids to experience fishing, but she also wants them to experience other things in life as well. So we try to kind of, settle on a destination that we both want. And I'm fortunate enough in the past to go up to Alaska, done some Canadian trips, gone to Montana, gone to all these locations in August and, had some really great experiences. Well, this year, with the timing of everyone's schedule, my daughter running one direction, my son a different. We've got football coming up. We've got sports, my wife's job, myself. We had family in town. It just didn't work out this year for us to go to a particular destination altogether. And so I still wanted to have a week of fishing, so I had taken that week off earlier in the year, knowing as those dates got closer that it wasn't going to work out for everyone's schedule. I basically schemed with my son that we were going to take a week and hit a bunch of different destinations. And so I want to recap some of that stuff, and I want to talk about that as we get into it. It was sort of unique, it was on the lines of discovery. We basically didn't have a game plan leading up to about a week or two before. And so I just sat down with him one night after dinner and I said, here's the deal. We got 5 days to fish. I want to hit 5 different lakes, or I want to go somewhere. We had plans of maybe going up to Lake of the Woods, hitting up Arneson's. We've been seeing, some of the tournaments and some of the anglers' posts of all the big walleyes. We had some thoughts about maybe zipping out to South Dakota, visiting with Marcus. We talked about going to North Dakota. We talked about going up to the North Shore. There was all these ideas that were thrown out there. And so we thought, you know what, let's just pick a few right now and see what works. I'll start making some phone calls. So I started making some phone calls, and obviously, if you listen to the Dialed In Angling podcast last week, one of our first destinations was Lake Superior. We wanted to fish lake trout up on Lake Superior, do some jigging, Lake Superior jigging. If you didn't listen to that podcast, you're going to want to tune in. It was a fantastic experience, but that was on our list, and so that one stuck first. I got a hold of Ethan from Lake Superior Jigging, and he's like, yeah, I got Monday off. So I was like, boom. I told Robbie, I said, okay, we got Monday plotted, Lake Superior. Okay. Started talking with my dad, started bouncing ideas off my dad, trying to get him in the mix, getting him out fishing. And, he had some buddies in Wisconsin that have a phenomenal lake, but they really don't do a ton of walleye fishing out there. They catch walleyes on occasion. And I thought, that'd be cool. So my son and I that night then pulled up the onX Fish Map and the app, and we're like, okay, let's start planning out our week. We know we're going lake trout fishing on Monday. Sunday's open. We've got Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Okay. We actually added an extra day in there for travel. Friday, we didn't really fish that much, but we had Sunday available. So I said, let's do this. There is a lake that is on my travels. I travel to Leech Lake. I travel to Winnie. I travel down to Mille Lacs. I travel all over. There's a couple lakes, but the one in particular that I go by all the time that I've never had an opportunity to fish. I drive by it, at least once a month, maybe a couple times a month, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. And I've never got an opportunity to fish it. And I said, let's just pull up the onX Fish Map, take a look at, stocking reports. Let's take a look at the data and see what that lake has to offer. We pulled it up and it looked okay. It looked like panfish were more predominant than walleyes, but it didn't have a great number of walleyes. It wasn't like an outlier or anything, but it had a decent amount of walleyes, but it just had a lot of fish in it. And so we started with that destination. I don't want to name the lake because of all the lakes that we fished that week. I'm going to sort of refrain from describing the exact lake, except maybe Lake Superior. But anyway, we drove to this destination on Sunday. We started out the week at this destination, and it turned out it was, on a scale of 1 to 10 for us as far as a fishing experience. I would rate it maybe a 3 or a 4. It ended up being sort of a bust, but that's if you're going to go out and sort of discover lakes and experiment and see what that lake has to offer going in blind or pretty much blind other than the onX Fish app. That's going to happen sometimes. We got out there, started seeing fish right away, noticed that, obviously it had a really sharp weed line. It was fairly clear. I didn't know what to expect as far as water clarity, but got out there fairly clear, noticed it had a really sharp weed line. We started fishing, and it was very apparent that it was, primarily a panfish lake. There was tons of gills, a few crappies, lots of bass, lots of little pike, very few walleyes that we could find. We did run into a few. They weren't real interested in what we were throwing. But the bottom line of that lake, in that discovery mode of that lake, was we fished almost the entire way around the lake, hitting all the big main lake points. It didn't have a lot of mid-lake structure in this particular lake. It was more of a long, narrow sort of bowl type of lake with really sharp drop-offs. And in hitting, I would say, about 3/4 of the lake, it wasn't particularly a large lake. We discovered pretty quickly that, this is primarily a bluegill bass lake. We did catch some fairly nice gills, even though we weren't specifically targeting gills. Found some nice gills, some decent bass, a lot of little pike. It's just one of those lakes that I get to check off the list now. Every time I drive over it, I don't have to wonder what's out there. And I love doing that. And I talk a lot about it on this podcast about how much I love living in Minnesota because of all the resources we have close, because of the location in the Midwest. I can run out to the Dakotas. I can run to Wisconsin. I can go to Canada. I can go to the Great Lakes, and it's all within a day's driving distance. Most of the time it's all within 3 hours of where I live in northern Minnesota. So being able to just check that lake off the list was fine with me. At the end of the day, my son and I went home. We obviously didn't keep any fish. We were able to kind of check that box on that lake and talk about our next day, and that was Lake Superior. We got into pretty much a full discussion last week about how great of an experience it was jigging lake trout on Superior.
Man Trap Lodge, a Park Rapids resort on beautiful Big Man Trap Lake. Features 16 decked-out private cabins with air conditioning, Wi-Fi, and a rare Northwood swimming pool. Cabins are available with 1 to 5 bedroom units to select from. Whether you're looking for a fishing trip, a family vacation, or a family reunion, Man Trap Lodge is the Park Rapids resort for you. Rent one of our fishing boats for a great day of fishing or a pontoon to cruise around the lake and relax. Man Trap Lodge is a truly magical Minnesota vacation spot that's fun for the whole family. Don't miss your chance to book your late summer or fall trip at Man Trap Lodge for some fantastic fishing. Check us out at mantraplodge.com.
Watertown, South Dakota is your hub for year-round fishing in the heart of the Glacial Lakes region. With Lakes Kempeska and Pelican right in town and dozens more just a short drive away, you'll find non-stop action for walleye, perch, and pike, just to name a few. When you're off the water, explore the Terry Redland Art Center, Bramble Park Zoo, and many other great museums. Plus, award-winning pizza and family-friendly fun around every corner. Easy to reach, hard to leave. Plan your next cast at visitwatertownsd.com. So much Watertown, so little time.
Since that podcast and since our experience last week on Lake Superior, we have talked to so many anglers. I have run into so many anglers that listen to the podcast, that saw our posts, that now follow Ethan on Lake Superior jigging. And they've talked about how great of experiences they've had on Lake Superior, not just jigging, but trolling, and how that lake has really come back. You know, I've talked in depth about that, how the smelt runs have really bounced back. The lake trout fishing is phenomenal. We've only scratched the surface of Lake Superior. I definitely want to get back up there. You know, ever since that trip, that's all we keep talking about is like when we can get a free day to get up there when it's calm, go back lake trout fishing. I also want to bring some trolling gear because when we were out with Ethan, we saw quite a few cohos up high. And, you know, I love catching cohos. I have great memories of catching them out on Lake Michigan. And so Lake Superior is definitely on the list. We had a great experience on that Monday. Just to recap real briefly, it was phenomenal. Way exceeded our expectations. So here we go from, you know, the first day of our vacation where the first fishing experience was mediocre to the second experience was phenomenal. It was out of this world, exceeded our expectations as far as fishing. We're still giggling and high-fiving from, you know, that lake trout experience. And again, for me, even though Lake Superior is in my backyard, it's sort of a little bit outside of my normal wheelhouse of fishing walleyes, smallmouth bass, pike occasionally, and of course a lot of panfish. And now it sort of consumes my my brain right now as far as how am I going to be able to get back to that destination, because it was such a fun experience. You know, my son already started football. He's back doing that. We're busy. I'm guiding this week. I had a full week of guiding. And so, you know, I keep thinking, what day would we be able to get back up there based on the experience we had? I want to do it. You know, I've ordered jigs already. I've got paddle tails. I've got tubes. I've got everything we need for jigging up there. Just need that time to get back up there and experience that again. So phenomenal experience. So if our first trip was a 3 or a 4 out of 10, our second day of our vacation fishing experience was more of a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10, to be honest with you. So moving into the third day of our vacation, and granted, some of the days we had planned out, some of the other days we were like, let's just pull up the onX Fish Map and sort of decide where we're going to go once we get in the truck. And so the third day was sort of like that. We took off, started heading north. We knew we wanted to fish northern Minnesota. We didn't necessarily want to just go to a brand new lake that we were unsure of like we did on our first day, but we knew we wanted to go to a destination that was either a big walleye destination or a big crappie destination. We had talked about kind of our third day of our vacation that we would either just target specifically big walleyes or big crappies. And so we just started heading north. We pulled up the onX Fish Map. There was a couple lakes that we had an idea that we wanted to fish. We actually picked a destination that I had fished before, but only in the winter. I had only fished it in the winter. I caught giant crappies on this lake in the winter. I actually found it when I was doing a little scouting for the Dialed In Angling TV show. And I had fished it way prior, like when I was a kid. I remember catching really big panfish in this lake, and I hadn't fished it in years. So I think it was season 1 of Dialed In Angling. I was sort of scouting all these different lakes, and I hit that lake in the winter. It wasn't a particular lake that I was sure that we were going to film on, but I definitely wanted to hit it and do a little scouting when I was hitting a series of lakes, to get a particular bite for the show. And so I was familiar with the lake, but I had never fished it in the boat. And so I told my son, I said, you know what? Today is kind of a calm day. I know we had talked about going to catch big walleyes and specifically targeting like really big walleyes. Like we didn't care about catching numbers of walleyes. We wanted to catch big walleyes. But given the fact that it was, sort of a calm day, also my son had some stuff going on in the afternoon, so I knew we couldn't venture too far from home. So I'm like, you know what? Let's try to stay within an hour and a half of home to 2 hours of home. And, I've got this idea of fishing crappies in the summer. I know they're out there. I know that the numbers probably aren't great, but there are some really, really big fish in this lake. I know there's big crappies. I know there's some big gills. What do you think about doing that? And he was all on board. He's like, heck yeah, I would love to go out and catch big crappies. I'm like, all right, well, I don't know a ton about this lake in the summer. I know that there's a fairly sharp weed line in the lake. I know there's some basin areas. If we can find some crappies shallow enough, I'll target them then. I'm not a huge fan of targeting crappies that are in a deep basin because I knew we weren't going to keep fish. And so we went out. I also knew this lake had a fairly decent walleye population, maybe not big walleyes, but I knew it had like eater size walleyes. So we had options there. So we just picked the lake. We pulled it up again on our onX Fish map, drove to it, got out there, didn't know what to expect. Matter of fact, the landings were fairly shallow. There was a couple landings on the lake. The first one we went to was way too shallow to get my boat in. Went to the next one. Could barely squeak the 2075 Pro V off the bunk trailer at this landing, but we were able to do it. I was comfortable enough that we could get it off. We could easily get it back on if I could sink the trailer. So we were able to do that. That's all part of the sort of discovery for me, is like figuring out where these landings are at. If you can get your boat off the trailer, sometimes that's a challenge, but that's all part of it. And, I will say just, because I love the app and I use it a lot, but the onX Fish app is really good for picking out landing destinations and getting driving directions to those landings. I know in the winter, it's helped me a lot going down little logging roads and forest roads to get some of these backwater lakes. It's also helped me with landings in the sense where, it might be a bunch of different side roads or gravel roads to get to certain landings, and it's easy to get turned around. And if you've ever pulled a boat down some of these smaller, let's say gravel roads or whatever, if you take the wrong road, it completely stinks to try to get that boat turned around on that gravel road. I've had to do it on logging roads before. It is a nightmare. And so by being able to pull up the app and then pull up the driving directions on that app is priceless. And I use that specific feature of the app more than anything else when I'm going somewhere. Obviously I use the app to research destinations, but using those driving directions is huge. And so we were able we went to the first landing. Like I said, it was way too shallow. There was no way I was getting my boat off the trailer. And so at that point, I'm thinking, oh man, not sure if we have to punt here and pick a different lake or what. And my son's like, hey, there's another access. So we drove to the other access, and lo and behold, I was able to. We got out and looked on the dock, and I was like, yeah, this is deep enough. I mean, definitely deep enough to push the boat off, and deep enough to kind of sink the trailer enough to get it back on there. So got out there, long story short, just started scanning weed lines, found a few walleyes right away. And so we threw on the walleyes. I caught like an 18-inch walleye right away. And then we were throwing on them, we were catching them. Our idea wasn't to catch walleyes, okay? But, in discovering new lakes, it's good to just scan and take your time. Like, I'm very patient when I'm scanning. I do it for if I'm fishing a tournament or even guiding. If you've ever been in my boat with me, it could be a destination that's brand new to me, or it could be a lake that I fish all the time. But if you get in my boat as a guide experience, when I get out there, I spend a lot of time looking. Sometimes you land on them right away. I've had other guide trips where an hour into it, I'm still scanning. I'm not seeing what I want to see, and I'm not just settling and just fishing. I never, even prior to forward-facing sonar, I'd never get out there and just start fishing. I always am scanning and looking. And so we got out there, we started scanning, got a 18-inch walleye right away, saw a couple others, missed a couple more, got another like 15-incher. But I was like, you know what? I'm really not seeing panfish on the weed line. And so did a little more searching, and we just weren't finding what I wanted. And, I sort of had, these memories of a couple days ago, and we were scouting a lake that we'd never fished before and just sort of striking out after striking out. And I thought, okay, just settle down. I'll be patient. Let's continue scanning down the break line here. If we don't see them on these weed lines, then you just got to start shifting out a little bit deeper. And so we grabbed the plastics and jigs. We had a few small jigging wraps. As soon as I got off the weed line, and I didn't really have to go out to the basin to find these fish. They were on the edges, but they were suspended just off the weed line. And so as soon as I hit that first school with my forward-facing sonar, I saw what looked to be crappies to me. I told my son, I said, they're only like 5 feet down, and they're suspended over this sharper break, but they're suspended, I would say, over 25 feet of water, but they're only 5 feet down. I grabbed a jig and a plastic. I threw it in there. The entire school came up to hit it. My first fish out of that school, honest, hand in the air, was a 14-inch crappie. And boom, we knew exactly what we wanted to do the rest of the day. That's what's cool about discovery. That's what's cool about learning new lakes. It's like once you pattern those fish in that particular lake, you can go to other areas of that lake and find fish in that same manner. So we ran down that break line, and we were casting small jigging wraps. We were also casting plastics. Most of the fish were anywhere from 4 to 8 feet down over anywhere from 20 to 28 feet of water. And they were all giant schools of crappies. We absolutely teed off on them one after the other, casting into those schools. You'd catch one. And crappies are interesting because a lot of times when they're that high in the water column, you can catch them on crankbaits. I wish I would have had some more micro crankbaits. I love casting like small shad wraps, like number 4, number 5 shad wraps, or even some of the finesse type of like ultra shads, things like that, into those schools of fish. I didn't have any of that stuff with me, but I did have jigging wraps, and I did have 16th ounce jigs with microplastics. And we would just go from school to school, casting into those fish. As soon as you catch one or two, especially if they were like in the heart of the school, those fish would go from like 4 or 5 feet down, and they would sink way down, right? And they would kind of swim out of the zone of the forward-facing sonar, and they'd get spooked. And you see that a lot in the winter where you catch a fish out of the school and it spooks them. Crappies are sort of like that. And the cool part about this particular lake that we were fishing, and it was such a fun experience because we had never fished it before in the summer, first of all. But second of all, to find those fish only 4 to 8 feet down over these basin areas and just kind of run them down and catch them one after another. We weren't keeping any fish, but to find those fish in the caliber of which we were catching them as far as the size structure, I could safely tell you that the smallest crappie we caught was maybe 11 and a half. Most of them were in that 12, 13 to 14 inch range. We didn't catch any 15s, but that top end of 14 and a half to 12 inch is really, really, really hard to find these days. I don't care where you're at in the Midwest, even into Canada, it's challenging to find big crappies. And when you do, they're a special fish. I can think of a few lakes across Minnesota that you can consistently catch fish like that. And to find those fish in the manner in which we did, just going out sort of blind, from the time that we got to the wrong landing, to the right landing, to running down weed lines, to finding them, it took about 3 hours, 3.5 hours to find those fish. And yes, forward-facing sonar played a big role, but also kind of not getting locked into fishing where I think the fish are going to be. I thought, based on water clarity and the weed lines, that there would still be fish relating to the weed lines. That wasn't the case. So as you get into August, you'll see a lot of these crappies will pull out into the basin areas or the edges of the basin areas. So if you're a crappie angler, I know a lot of panfish anglers in particular, they tend to target them in the spring and then maybe again later in the fall. But summer is a great time to go out and find big schools of crappies. They're starting to get really grouped up right now. They're sliding out to these basin areas, and it can be a fantastic experience. We caught, no lie, I would say upwards of 50 plus crappies on our adventure. Like I said, we had to cut it out a little bit early. My son had some things going on with sports that afternoon, so we had to be home for that. But what a great experience. Another 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 type of experience for our week of fishing. And so I want to get more into the rest of the week. Those, I gave you the 3. I'll touch on a couple more experiences here, but we're going to take a quick break on Dialed In Angling. Stay tuned. I want to recap the rest of the week. A lot of our destinations that we picked are definitely things that you can do on lakes right now in August to put more fish in the boat. So stay tuned. We got more Dialed In Angling coming your way.
onX Fish is the best tool I have ever used for finding new lakes to target. Download the app today to get fisheries informations in the state of Minnesota and Wisconsin, along with research tools for serious anglers and beginners alike. Filter lakes by species, trophy only, keeper fish, abundance, or all of the above. Plan which lakes to fish with the app, navigate to the accesses, and once you're there, use the onX best-in-class weather imagery and fishing hotspots to catch more fish. onX Fish is a phenomenal tool both on and off the water for discovering new fishing opportunities, many of which you would never known existed. onX Fish, the app that is changing the game on ice.
Visit Cook County, Minnesota, a year-round fishing destination like no other. Spring brings steelhead and smelt runs along the Lake Superior shoreline. In summer, cast for walleye, lake trout, and northern pike in the region's inland lakes and rivers. As the leaves change, so does the fishing, with fall offering some of the best lake trout action around. When winter settles in, grab your gear and head out for ice fishing in a true northern wilderness setting. Whether you're an experienced angler or just discovering the joy of casting a line, Cook County has a spot and a season for you. Learn more and start planning your fishing trip at visitcookcounty.com.
Arneson's Rocky Point Resort in northern Minnesota offers a little something for everyone. Nestled on Lake of the Woods South Shore, it provides easy access to 14 remarkable reefs. Serious anglers know that Arneson's offers some of the best fishing, charter fishing, and small boat fishing options, all supported by the largest protected marina on the lake's South Shore. Accommodation selections range from 1 to 5 bedrooms. Equipped with all the modern conveniences, guests can enjoy a delightful dining experience and stunning lake views at the Rock Harbor Lodge, an on-site full-service bar and restaurant. The 2 beaches provide hours of fun for the whole family. Whether you're seeking an idyllic fishing spot or a relaxing vacation, Arneson's Rocky Point has everything you need. Check them out at arnesonsresort.com. Okay, welcome back. Recapping the week once again, just doing a deep dive into this fantastic week of fishing that my son and I had, some of which we shot from the hip and just picked destinations that, we wanted to fish or, we sort of brainstormed at night. Other trips were planned. This particular trip that I'm going to talk about next was fairly planned. It's been on our radar and it's been something that I've wanted to do for a long time. The individual that we fished with really doesn't need an introduction. He goes by the name of Mr. Walleye. It's my Uncle Gary, Gary Roach. My Uncle Gary is a wild man when it comes to fishing. If anyone knows him personally, he's, first of all, one of the nicest guys you'd ever meet in the fishing industry. He talks to everybody. He loves hearing everybody's story. He loves talking fishing, even at his age. And he's experienced so many different fishing experiences all across the planet. He's always still excited about fishing, and he goes fishing all the time. Him and I talk all the time on the phone. He's telling me about crappie destinations, that walleye, smallmouth, whatever it is. He's excited to get out there and get after it, just like we are. He's a fish head through and through, and I love fishing with Gary. Anytime I get a day off, I love jumping in the boat with Gary. My dad, myself, Gary, Robbie, my son, we all love fishing with Gary because he's just so passionate about it. And it doesn't matter if it's a 10-inch crappie or a 30-inch walleye. He always is excited to catch fish. He loves patterning them. Everything that I love about fishing and what makes me a fish head. I see Gary. He's the same thing, and then some. To be at the age that he's at and still be as passionate about fishing and discovery as he is amazing to me. He's like sort of the Energizer Bunny. He's an inspiration. I love fishing with him. First of all, I love hanging out with him. I love going over there. He's always excited to get out. Gary's always, if you pull into his driveway, that is like, for this particular trip, we were going fishing with Gary. He had his rod sitting out there, his lunch. He's ready to go. So if he tells you to be there at 8, you better be there a little bit early because he's ready to get out fishing. And so we were going fishing with Gary. We had already fished, the one lake where the question mark lake, the first day we went lake trout fishing. We had giant crappie day. Now we're going fishing with Gary Roach. Gary had been talking about catching these whitefish, and I'm not going to name the lake, but Gary loves fishing all sorts of different species, but he had been talking about catching whitefish and how fun of an experience it was. And it's sort of like lake trout fishing in the sense where you hook into these whitefish and they fight like crazy. And I had caught a few whitefish before. I had gone out to Green Bay. I had fished whitefish a little bit with jigging Raps, but I really never just went out and targeted specifically whitefish. And listening to like Jim Linder, Al, all those guys, especially Jimmy and I have talked in depth about catching whitefish, like with jigging Raps, for example. I know the Linders have done shows about catching whitefish. I just wanted to experience it, and Gary knows a lot about it. He does it quite often. He's very, very well versed as far as where to go and where to catch them. And, he's been talking to me about it for a long time. He's like, we got to do it. We got to do it. You got to come out and experience it. Bring Robbie with you. Robbie will absolutely love it. If you like catching lake trout, you'll love catching whitefish. For me, I personally like catching tulibies, for example, in the winter. I think they're exciting. They're fun. I've always thought in the summer when the tulibies are surfacing that there ought to be a way that I can cast out like a small spoon or something and catch those fish. I know being on the mudflats in Mille Lacs, for example, in the summer, like in June when it's dead flat calm and there's bug hatches going on, there's thousands of tulibies at the surface. And it's sort of always been an intrigue of mine, like, God, I would love to just target those fish, specifically. Well, whitefish, tulibies are basically a lesser whitefish, right? They're in the same family, much smaller. The whitefish that we're catching are much bigger, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I caught one upwards of 10 pounds, which I'll get into, but never went out specifically targeting whitefish. Whitefish live in cold water. They're pelagic. They spend, most of their time out in cold water all season long. They'll come in the fall and they'll move much shallower. But in the summer months like this, a lot of them are out into 50, 60 feet. They're suspended, but they're in that cold water area, right? You can a lot of times see on your graph, sort of the thermoclines on certain lakes. And, that for me helps me, fish in different areas based on the stratification that I'm seeing in the water. Well, you get out into some of that 60, 70, 80 feet of water, you can definitely see the stratification of different temperatures on your graph if you look carefully. If you ever see that distinct line in your graph, that's usually a temperature change. And so got out there with Gary. He obviously knows a ton about it. He does a ton of white fishing all over the place in the summer, periodically. And, he's got different destinations across northern Minnesota that he likes fishing. Now, whitefish, if you look at a map, I mean, basically to find whitefish, you got to pick lakes that, are over 100 feet deep. A lot of them have deeper basins. You can kind of look up. When I was up on Lake Superior with Ethan, he was talking about catching whitefish on Lake Superior. Ton of them out there. But basically, you're looking for lakes that have those cold water opportunities where those fish can thrive. And so got to Gary's house. We were going to take my boat because, I had forward-facing sonar. Plus, I wanted to learn how to do it on my own. And, he was willing to just jump in my boat and come out with Robbie and I and bring us to different areas. And then we just started looking for them. And, of course, another new fishing experience, which I was pumped about because, now we're on day 4 of new experiences and we're targeting a completely different species that was definitely out of my wheelhouse and definitely not on my particular fishing radar. But because Gary has talked about it quite often, and I had watched some videos that Jim Linder had done, that Al had produced, and it piqued our interest. Robbie and I were excited to get out there and do it. We get out there, we start looking, and yeah, we're finding these fish kind of all over. And it wasn't until we found better numbers of fish where they were really biting super well. And what the cool part is, once you hook up on them, they do fight like a lake trout. They're amazing. Like anyone listening to this podcast, if you've never fished whitefish, as we get into fall here, especially in September, but even August, if you know lakes in northern Minnesota or in Canada or the Great Lakes, for that example, if you've ever wanted to target whitefish, it's fairly easy. Jigging spoons, jigging wraps, just small baits like that, getting it down there and presenting those baits in front of those fish. They're aggressive. They bite, especially if you get into schools. If it's just like anything else, it's just like the crappies that were suspended. If we were throwing on just a couple crappies, it was harder to get them to strike. If you threw on a school of 10, you were getting bit. And so the same with whitefish. If we got into schools that were 10, 15, 20 fish, they were biting. And you drop down, you're basically vertical jigging just like we were the lake trout. You set the hook and it is a battle. I mean, we were using, I would say, medium light rods in that 7-foot category, very light braid. We were using longer fluorocarbon leaders, 6-pound to 8-pound fluorocarbon leaders. And when you hooked onto a fish, man, that was a tussle. That was fun. We've caught some really, really big whitefish with Gary. Again, completely exceeded my expectations as far as the fish themselves, how they fight, and just a fish that I don't think much about. Minnesota has actually dropped the limit on whitefish and tullibees over the last few years, much like they did with the burbot populations, just because they are a special fish. Now, after having fished them, I have a lot more respect for the species. I will definitely be targeting them in other lakes that I know of. As soon as we got done fishing with Gary, I pulled up my map and I started looking at different lakes that I fish all the time, including Leech Lake and some others that have whitefish in them that I never even would have thought about that. I mean, I've seen them on my graph and I knew they were there, but I just never really put a whole lot of thought into catching them. Now that I've caught them with Gary and I had that experience, I will definitely be going whitefish fishing again. And the other cool part is they're really good eating fish. People talk about table fare. Whitefish are excellent. We actually kept a couple whitefish. The entire week we weren't really keeping fish, but in this particular instance, it sort of piqued my curiosity, not only for catching them, but also eating them. Only time I've ever eaten whitefish was kind of in the UP. I had it at a restaurant. It was fine. I don't really remember what it tasted like. I remember it being kind of a flaky sort of meat. But we kept them, put them on the smoker, and we actually cooked a few. Fantastic eating fish. Now, the fish that I ate, I didn't freeze. I will say one thing about whitefish: if you catch them, they got a little bit of a pin bone, but they're big enough that you can actually pull the pin bones out and then bake your fish or fry your fish or whatever. I just took small chunks of the whitefish. I fried them. The other thing about a whitefish that you need to know where they get kind of that oily reputation is on the backside, the lateral line. There is sort of that gray, reddish, oily stuff. You want to cut that out and just eat the white meat, right? If you eat that other stuff, it's very fishy, it's very oily. And so when I cut them up in chunks just to fry them, I just fried them in batter and just sort of pan fried a few pieces. Excellent eating, but you just want to eat the white meat. And that's pretty common for a lot of fish that have that really dark lateral line. I'm used to that when we go saltwater fishing. Redfish, for example, have that really dark red lateral line or that fatty oil in the back. You want to cut that out and just eat the white meat. It's not very deep in the center. If you're familiar with like zippering fish, a lot of you go out to North Dakota. That was the first time I learned that out in Devil's Lake. They take their walleyes, they fillet them off the skin, and then they cut down the lateral line, and then it allows you to kind of cut out that red part of the fish. And even some of the walleyes in Devil's Lake get that really red lateral line because they eat a lot of freshwater shrimp. You cut that out, you eat the white meat. It's fantastic. Whitefish is no different. Frying them up fresh were phenomenal. I've got a bunch that we're going to smoke here, even as early as this weekend. I can't wait to get them on the smoker. I know the football season's coming up. I love having smoked fish dip for the Vikings game. So we usually get together with some friends every once in a while to watch the Vikings. And I love serving wild game. I love serving fish, different types of dishes that are a little bit different than people are used to. I can't wait to smoke up some of this whitefish. Super fun experience. Again, any anglers, if you've ever thought about it, or maybe you've never thought about white fishing, it's really easy. Pick lakes that have whitefish. You can go on your onX Fish Map. You can find them. They're pretty deep fish right now. Again, we targeted a handful. We caught, I think we caught 8 or 9 total in the day, and we kept them. Gary kept a couple. Robbie and I kept a couple. We caught them in a little bit deeper water, but a really, really fun experience that, coming from a kid that's from Minnesota, I had caught a few. Like I said, I went out to Green Bay, fished with JJ Milovitz and actually Joel Nelson of onX Fish. Him and I went out a long time ago and caught them in the winter, but never really targeted them in the summer. So again, fish experience, I would say 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 for our week of fishing. Last trip on our list of week of fishing, we're heading over to Wisconsin. I don't get an opportunity to fish inland lakes in Wisconsin very often. It's just, I don't know. I need to more because after being in the Hayward area filming Dialed In Angling with Ty Sennett, it's amazing to me the fisheries that they have in Wisconsin, especially in northern Wisconsin. But I don't get to fish a lot of the inland lakes. And, we had been talking about fishing over in Wisconsin all summer. My dad's buddy has a cabin over there. I had been over there crappie fishing in the spring, but that's about the gist of my fishing over on this particular lake. Now, he lives on sort of a flowage lake. He talks about catching walleyes off his pontoon, just trolling shad raps along the shoreline. He said he doesn't catch big numbers, but, knows they're in there, knows a few neighbors that have gotten some big fish. And so to kind of end cap our week, we headed over to Wisconsin. We got up super early in the morning. From where I live to, some of those lakes is only about 2 hours. And so we got in the truck in the morning, headed over there to a lake that we really didn't know much about. On our way there, we did pull up the onX Fish app. We looked at the map. I pulled up the map on my Lowrance. It had tons of structure. Yes, it's a flowage, but there was tons of islands and all sorts of different structure in this flowage. So I'm like, it'll be cool. Let's go over there. We don't know much about water clarity. We don't know much about walleye numbers. Sounds like a fun experience, a good time to catch up with some old friends. And so we got out there, dropped the boat in the water, had some bait. You know, our idea was to specifically target walleyes and smallmouth, but we're going to keep our options open if we're seeing other fish, if we're seeing suspended schools of walleyes, crappies, bluegills, whatever. We don't care. And so we get out there, we start scanning, and it didn't take long. We started finding walleyes. This particular lake in Wisconsin, like a lot of lakes, they have reduced bag limits. Some of them have 2, some have 3. This lake has 3. Went out there. We wanted to keep a couple walleyes to do like a little fish fry. But other than that, we're just going to like catch and release and hopefully target some big ones and just have a good, again, discovery experience of a new lake. And we got out there. It didn't take long. What I noticed is, again, the weed lines were really sharp, but it was a shallower weed line. The weed lines were up in like 6 feet of water, pretty stark, you know, boom, and a lot of rock. There was a lot of rocky points and I wouldn't say like jagged rock, but a lot of rocky points. First thing we started bumping into, though, were smallmouth bass. Lots and lots of smallmouth bass and decent size. You know, I wouldn't say they were giants. They weren't Mille Lacs caliber smallmouth by any stretch of the means or leech or whatever. They were nice quality smallmouth, a lot of 16 to 18 inches, but they were in big numbers. And we started catching smallmouth right away, even though we were trying to target walleyes. And then as soon as I started sliding off the edges, we started noticing suspended walleyes. And some are individuals, some are in 2 and 3 packs. You know, in the past on our podcast, I've talked about these suspended walleyes that are only 4 or 5 feet below the surface. Well, this lake had a ton of bait fish, and in the morning it was dead flat calm. It was a little cooler. I know we've had some warmer temps as of late, but in the morning, a lot of the bait fish were up high, and that's where the smallmouth were. That's where the walleyes were. Yes, they were sort of loosely relating to structure, but they were off the edge and they weren't very far down in the water column. And so we were throwing bobbers, we were throwing jig crawlers, we were throwing plastics, and doing extremely well. We ended up catching a lot of walleyes that day, a lot of smallmouth, but then bonus fish, we got some really big gills. I mean, like gills that are good ones anywhere you go, where they're in that 10-inch category, 10 and a half, really well-built fish. And it was sort of surprising. They were sort of like bonus fish. You'd find schools of gills off the edge, but the bigger ones were either lower in the water column or they were kind of on their own. So like when you shined on them with the forward-facing sonar, you'd be like, oh man, those are nice returns, but they don't look like walleyes. They're more bulbous, you know, and casting on them, and they were big gills. And what's fun is if you throw a jig out there, a jig in a plastic for a gill, and you set the hook and you're catching them in 10 to 15 feet of water, those things fight like crazy. You know, you want to talk about smallmouth bass fighting like crazy in a flowage. Big gills in a flowage fight like crazy. And so another great experience. That was sort of the end cap of our week of catching these fish in Wisconsin. After we were done fishing, went out to a nice dinner with our friends, went to a little pizza joint. You know, I love Wisconsin because there's all these little bar restaurants that are back in the woods that have phenomenal food. If you've ever been to northern Wisconsin, you know, there's a little hole in the wall bars that have really, really good food, whether it's burgers, chicken, pizza. It's like, if you talk to enough locals, you can find some kind of off the beaten path places in Wisconsin where the food is phenomenal. And I love doing that. I will definitely be going back to northern Wisconsin again. I want to hook up with like Ty Sennett over there. He's real dialed in that Hayward area. I want to get back over there. But to cap off our week with a new experience in Wisconsin where it sort of turns that light bulb on of, hey, man, there's a ton of fisheries over here that are sort of untapped or new to me that I want to experience. It was super, super fun. So just to recap the week, the only day that I would call it a bust, because that trip was definitely 9 out of 10 again. The only day that was a bust out of an entire discovery week was the first day. I can live with that. Out of 5 different fishing experiences, to have one day be sort of mediocre compared to the rest were phenomenal. I would chalk that up to any fishing week that I've had in my life, you know, to just sort of shoot from the hip, discover new lakes, try new things, fish species that I had never fished before, to target species in a manner in which I hadn't fished in a long time, like lake trout jigging, was really, really fun. And we did it all on a fairly inexpensive way. I mean, we didn't have any real lodging expenses. We drove to each destination. We slept in our own beds almost every night, although in Wisconsin, we stayed at my dad's buddy's place. So no expenses there. Just had a little bit of fuel, a little bit of bait, and we had an unbelievable week. So that just goes to show you, you don't have to, spend a ton of money to go and have these great fishing experiences. A lot of these great fishing experiences are in our own backyard, are in the Midwest. They're just waiting to be discovered. I had a phenomenal week. A lot of the fishing that I did in those areas really kind of, like I said, turned on that light bulb, or it was a light bulb moment for me that I want to do them again. And so, you just got to pick a date on the calendar. Everyone's schedules get so busy and you get so kind of in your routine. I know for me, guiding, it's sort of like, I get in this routine of guiding every single day that, I have to take time to experience trips with my son, with my dad, with my Uncle Gary, because I don't want to look back 10, 15 years from now and say, man, I wish I would have taken more time to fish these destinations, to experience this with people that I absolutely love fishing and love fishing as much as me, but people that I absolutely love and sharing experiences with. We did it. We picked a date, we picked the dates, and we stuck to it. I could have guided all last week. I had a lot of customers calling. I had, I could have booked the entire week, but I didn't. I do not regret 1 second of last week. Had an absolute blast, and what a fun week it was. So even though it's the dog days of summer, it doesn't have to be. There's plenty of fishing experiences out there as we get towards the end of August, even into September. I know September, for a lot of people, as soon as Labor Day hits, they start thinking fall. I do too. But September's really sort of I want to call it summer 2.0, because when you get into the first part of September anyway, it's still summer patterns. We're going to talk about that more on upcoming Dialed In Angling podcasts. We're going to have a ton of different adventures for you. We've got a lot of new guests, so I appreciate each and every one of you tuning in. Good luck fishing. Until next week, I'm Tony Roach, and this has been the Dialed In Angling podcast.